Now let's take a look at the erase operation on a doubly linked list. So again, this is going to replace the remove after operation, because when we receive an iterator to erase, that iterator points to a node that has both a previous and next pointer. And what that means is that we can go both directions and find the two nodes we need to fix up. So we don't need to only remove after an iterator anymore like we did on a singly linked list. We can get the iterator and directly remove that node. So in all the cases we're considering here, we need to update the next pointer of the previous node and the previous pointer of the following node in order to ensure that our two lists are linked up together properly. And then there are four special cases we need to think about. One, let's say we have a node with only a single, let's say we have a list with only a single node. In that case, when we delete that single node, we're going to need to update the head and tail to null. The next case is that we want to erase the head of a list with more than one item. So in that case, we're going to need to update the head pointer, and we're also going to need to update the previous pointer of the new head to point to null. Or we might be erasing the tail of a list with more than one item. And in that case, we're going to need to erase that tail and then update the tail pointer to point to the new tail and update the tail's next pointer to point to null. Okay, and in the last case, erasing a node in the middle that's neither the head or the tail, we're going to have to go in, connect the two nodes on either side of it to point to each other, as I just talked about up here in this first point, that we need to update the next pointer of the previous node and the previous pointer of the following node, or the one we're deleting. And that'll fix it up. Now, because many of these cases here, these first three cases are very similar to cases we've already handled. I'm not going to talk a lot more about them. I'm just going to focus on erasing a node in the middle that's neither the head nor the tail. So we might start out with a list like this over here on the left, and I have an iterator pointing to eggs, and I want to remove eggs from my list. So the main two operations I need for that is to make the next pointer of the previous node, in other words, milk, point to bread, and then I need to make the previous pointer of the next node, which would be bread's previous pointer, point to back to milk, right? So I need to connect this here and connect this here. And I'm showing that over here with these red arrows. So I make the milk node point all the way over to bread. I make the bread node point all the way back to milk. And then we can delete eggs from the list. And our next list and our previous list are now set up properly. Now, what that might look like in code, there are a few ways you could do that. But what we could say is that it.node, right, that's this iterator, arrow takes us to eggs, previous takes us back to milk, and then next, so it node previous next grabs this black box for us and sets it equal to what comes after the node we're deleting, it node next. And then we need to do the same thing again, but in reverse. So we go it node, we follow the next pointer, and then we grab its previous. So that's it node, arrow next, arrow previous. That gives us this. And then we set this equal to the node that comes before the iterator node. Okay, and so after these two lines of code, we have these arrows set up the way they should be. Okay, so that gives us some code that looks like this. There are actually lots of ways you could write this code. Maybe a more direct way to write this code would be to lay it out in all those four cases I just described. But this implementation is what they have in Zybook, so I'm just going to briefly talk through this. So this version of the code kind of consolidates all those cases into a few short statements. So first, we're going to create a pointer called successor that's pointing at the node after the iterator, and we create a pointer called pred that's pointing at the predecessor of the iterator. Right, so we just get node next and node previous, and then we remember these. And now we can just have direct access to that successor and predecessor without writing this longer piece of code every time, and that's a nice convenience. Now, it's possible that this successor and this predecessor could be null if I fall into one of those cases where I'm at the tail of the list or the head of the list. So I'm going to have to do some checking down here when we start manipulating our pointers. So if successor does not equal null pointer, right, this is checking to see if in fact I'm pointing if the node I'm pointing to with my iterator is already the tail. Because if successor is null pointer, it is the tail. But if successor is not null pointer, then I need to set the previous of that node to the predecessor of the node I'm removing. Okay, and then similar, if the predecessor is not null, in other words, if the node I'm removing is not the head, then that means there's a node before it, and I should set its next field to point to the successor of the node I'm removing. Okay, so this takes care of that middle case. And these guarding ifs just make sure that I'm not at the head or the tail and about to access a null pointer. So this takes care of the middle case. And then I need to check, do I need to update the head or tail pointer of the list? So if the node I'm removing is currently the head, then I need to update the head to point to its successor. Likewise, if the node I'm removing is currently the tail, then I need to update the tail to point to its predecessor. And after we do all these things, we need to actually delete the node. We shouldn't leave it there in memory. This is the Zybook code. If you follow along there, it doesn't show this delete because they're not really showing you C++ code, right? They're just showing you pseudocode. And so this detail is omitted. But in our C++ implementation, because we don't want to have a memory leak, we want to manage memory properly, then we need to delete the node that was in our linked list before. Okay, so in summary, doubly linked lists allow efficient traversal in forward and reverse directions. And now we can implement an efficient erase operation that just takes an iterator to the node we want to erase, and it can just directly erase it without having to traverse the list to find the previous node, like in a singly linked list. We also now could do a reverse traversal of a doubly linked list. This comes at the cost of these additional, the additional memory overhead of the previous pointer and the extra cost of operations to keep those previous pointers up to date. And we saw that like the append function was almost identical to the append for a singly linked list, but insert after got a little more complicated. The big O of insertion and removal is pretty much the same as that of the singly linked list. It's namely O1. And so in terms of efficiency, our doubly linked list is really the same as our singly linked list. However, the key improvement we get is that finding a previous node in a doubly linked list is now order 1, whereas in a singly linked list, finding a previous node would have required you to go back to the beginning of the list and search back through to find it, which would have been ON. So that would have been a lot more expensive. So the doubly linked list is a nice improvement if that's a function, an operation that you really need on your list.